My name is Robert Lilly, but all my friends call me Brother Rob, and I emphasize the word brother because today that's all I'm seeking to do for another is be a brother. I've been asked today to talk about grief for this project, Tempered Steel, and it's the reflections of the formerly incarcerated persons. So the way I think I'm going to approach this is, initially when this was brought to my attention about grieving, one of the observations I made was, I've had emotions over the years after my release from incarceration, and I've now been home for 7 years, and approximately 17 years of my life have been spent inside some kind of institution. And so in the 7 years that I've been home, I've had emotions, but I didn't always have vocabulary to describe those emotions. And so I've heard about a thing called the grieving process, but I wasn't necessarily those were not thoughts that would come to my mind when I would have certain kinds of emotions that now I know are or were grieving. So when I was asked to do this project and I was responsible for giving the first example, one of the things that jumped into my mind off the top was the grief that I felt in two instances that I think both relate to the same issue. And that's friendships that I bonded with other men to form when I was incarcerated, men that became influences in my life in ways that my life has been radically transformed because of. These men, when it came time for me to leave from one facility and go to another, I remember gut-wrenchingly crying my heart out because I would miss them when I left them. These are men that I had learned to tell my darkest secrets to share my worst fears, to dream dreams that others probably would say were impossible to dream for someone like us. But these men and we shared that common belief in the impossibility of what our lives could amount to, provided we had the kind of supports outside prison. And so these men not only dreamt with me, but we found ways to be creative inside the institution to create an environment that reflected our desire to succeed after our release from incarceration. These men I would identify as leaders, but nonetheless, there were some that weren't leaders, and I still had for them the same kind of enthusiasm and passion and love and longing when I left them to return back to their association. That was the first instance. I had been in one facility at not Seagoville. I was at Colorado City. I had been there for approximately 3 years. And there were 3 brothers at that facility, Albert Amir Parks, Johnny Hatton, and Eric Ladaro Hopkins. These 3 persons, along with myself, we formed an organization called the Universal Temple of Peace. And it was our intent to call young men away from and out of the gangs and into a more dignified way of becoming a man. Education was critical to what we were doing. And the bond that we formed with one another to do this work, I don't think we could have succeeded as we did with that kind of love and enthusiasm for the work and love for one another. And so leaving these men was truly a hard thing because I was afraid, where was I going? Into what? And would I find men like this ever again? That was my biggest concern. So when I left, I did find others that I could find love for, and I found others that I wanted to keep in contact with. Unfortunately, many of the others that I came across after leaving that facility, we haven't kept in contact, but those men we did. And so when it came time for me to be released from imprisonment, not just go to another facility, I remember being here in the community and grateful for all the wonderful things that are now coming to my life in terms of freedom and liberty to dress as I wished, to go where I wished, to eat what I wished. Beautiful things that we dream of and we want so much when we're incarcerated, along with having relationships and achieving some certain personal goals. But my heart was always heavy and still is because I found the most wonderful fellowship with those brothers when I was incarcerated that And although I say this with a bit of caution and hesitation, I have wonderful people in my life today that I love dearly. It's not the same. I would equate it to like going to war with somebody, or I have had female intimacy relationships, and usually it's not until after that first serious tiff or fight that we have that you start realizing how much that person means to you, or that person stands by your side when you go through a tragedy or a loss. That relationship becomes that much more qualitatively supportive and profound. Same thing with men. I think I have not been to war, but I've been one who ran as a gang member in the streets and had loyalty for the brotherhood that we bonded and formed in the streets. But I learned later that that was false because we were doing things without knowledge. These men that I learned to love in the way that I loved them, they were special. And leaving them was never an option. Physically, I may have had to leave them, but emotionally and psychologically and spiritually, I was still there with them in that prison, and I wanted them to have what I have out here, and that's the opportunity to realize what God has given us to become all that we can with this life that we have. And so, because I was the first one out, and many of them, I think the next one to come home would be 7 years. Well, actually, would be about 3 years. This is another gentleman, but he wasn't part of our close circle. But because he reached out to me when he was inside, I found a love for him and decided to support him. So I continued to write him. And he came home, but he was a part of our group, but not as intimately interwoven into it. And so some of the others, it took them more than several years to come home, and just waiting for them to come home, hoping that they would get parole. All of that process opens up, I think, the same feelings of loss and discomfort in a relationship that one would have when you feel like something is not in your possession that you yearn to have. I wanted those men home, and I want them home with me now, because I believe that the same energy and enthusiasm we had for the cause that we stood for while we were incarcerated, if that energy were released into the community, and I use that word with the most sincerest intention, released. If we could release that energy, that dynamism, man, I think we could shake up the world. So I've stayed with them. I've been walking with them despite my distance from them, because I realized that they have made my life that much better because of knowing them. So in that way, that's been a great experience with grief. A third example that I gave was one day I was flipping through some family photo albums, and I had this, it was a gnawing awareness that gradually wrapped its arms around me and held me as I'm flipping from page to page in this photo album. I'm looking at all my family, and I'm watching the years go by, and my picture is nowhere in sight. I have very few images of myself as a young man with my family, because for the most part of my teens and 20s and some of my 30s, I was incarcerated. Mind you, it was an installment plan incarceration. I would get out and I would come home. I would come home and only return to the same behaviors and then return back to prison. And so as I'm looking at my family album, I noticed that I'm not even there. And that, I think, also could be properly identified as an instance in which I experienced grief, because I realized how much loss has occurred in my life as a result of my being incarcerated. And I don't know if I can even convey to you what it's like to have someone who you identify as a family member who came from the same womb as you, and yet you don't even really have a relationship with them, or you don't know how to have a relationship with them. And even in some instances, when they touch you, it doesn't feel like the comforting touch of a loved one. It feels like the touch of a stranger. And you hate that feeling because you realize that so much time has been slipping away. So what I've learned about grieving is that there's stages in this process. I couldn't cite to you all of the stages right now, but I know that there's 5 stages. And as I recall reading about grieving, the last point that I think was important for me to say was, if I don't have a vocabulary to describe my emotions, I'm having an experience, but I don't understand what I'm experiencing. I don't think I'm empowered under those circumstances to make a difference in my own life, to change the way I feel so that life can feel better, more comfortable, and I can be more well-adjusted. And even once I have a vocabulary to describe the feelings I possess, the next part then becomes, what is this experience? And how do I have it in such a way that I don't sabotage my victories or sabotage the progress that I've made? And so I think learning about grieving, and this is what made me enthused about the project, I think learning about grieving and understanding it and learning how the stages operate and learning that they don't, sometimes you repeat stages, or you have to finish one cycle to go to the next cycle so that you can have closure. I think knowing that takes away some of the desperation that sometimes can creep up in my heart and probably others who feel like these bad times or these hard times or whatever this energy is, this negative energy I feel, like it won't stop, it won't go away. And so if it won't go away, then I've got to do something desperately to change it. And I think a lot of people return to behaviors that cause them to repeat their experiences with incarceration, recidivize. That's been my story. So my hope would be that through sharing the ideas that I'm sharing with you now, in some way you can get a glimpse into the window of what it is to live inside someone like my mind. And I think that if you could just for a moment entertain some of the ideas I've shared, perhaps you may have more sympathy and empathy for people who lack the ability to share the words that I'm sharing with you and can express ideas the way I'm blessed to be able to express my ideas. Because at the end of the day, I believe that what I'm doing now can be learned, but we have to have people to invest in us. And sometimes these mental and emotional instabilities and somebody like my life, somebody that's a returning citizen or a formerly incarcerated person who's reentering community, those relationships, if he can't form them, he or she, their freedom is tenuous. So please heed these words and meditate upon them. And my prayers are that your mind is opened about what it is to be someone else that you're not, especially someone who's had to endure trauma. And I do believe being taken away from your home, sent someplace far away that you're unfamiliar with, forced to deal with people that you don't know for years at a time, no access to relatives because you're too far for them to travel, only communicating by phone if you can or by letter if they write, and then finding a new family and then being taken away from that family, not because you've done anything bad, but because something wonderful is happening, but you can't share it with them, how that might cause somebody to have grief. Yeah. When it comes to my grieving and dealing with that grief, I think I'm doing better at communicating my feelings with other people. I have a group of men in my life today who, they know my secrets. I realized that at some point that if I was going to ever fare well out here, I had to find men that I could identify with as I once identified with the men who I was incarcerated with. And it's been a process. But I now today have men who are genuine in my estimation. And so I rely on them, I trust them, and I share my thoughts with them. And that helps me cope. Even acknowledging that I have feelings and acknowledging that I need to work through these feelings, grief being one of those feelings, this I think is important as well. And then beyond that, there are times when I don't handle it so well. Just to be quite candid with you, that I fall into despair and I find myself worrying and stressing. And it's those times when I'm most vulnerable to repeat the errors of my past. And those are dangerous times. Those really are. But thankfully, I've been able to reach out even in those times to let somebody know, hey, I'm struggling. I'm not doing so good right now. And people have responded with love and compassion, and it's made things easier. And one of the most effective ways sometimes is just for me to distract myself through reading. And I love to read. And so reading a book about something that deals with the issue that I've been finding myself wrestling with, it increases my enthusiasm to want to change the issue or do something about it instead of just simply being impacted by it, being knocked off balance. And so those are the ways that I've been handling it. Redemption is an important idea to me personally because when I was incarcerated and I began to look at what my future could be. Well, let me back up. I remember back in the 90s, they were debating whether or not inmates should receive certain kinds of amenities, like access to the commissary or certain products on commissary, lifting weights. That these things were privileges that were making prison a soft place and were coddling criminals. And what was particular about the debate around this time was the language that they were using, the language that they were using to describe us. I remember vividly hearing talk about super predators. If we got access to weights, we'd be super predators. Or if we were given education, that we would be educated criminals. And that we didn't deserve this opportunity, that we were taking something away from the general population that we weren't entitled to because of the crimes we had committed. That language and that conversation, that dialogue really offended me because even though they didn't use the name Robert Lilly, I felt very much that I was included in that discourse because I was, in fact, a part of the population of the incarcerated. And so I started to formulate in my head a response to that. And what I concluded was that I had to learn ways in which to validate my own humanity. I had to count. That meant that I had to find the motivation to come to the table. Now, mind you, I'm incarcerated, so what table am I going to come to? There are no dignitaries entering into the prison. There are no committees or boards that interact with inmates. And so the way I began this journey was I began to teach other men in prison my thoughts, share my ideas. I would read this information and I would formulate my response in hopes that one day I would be before an audience and I'd be able to say the things that I was saying to them then, later, to others. And one of the terms that I clung to battle this dehumanizing discourse that was discounting our humanity, and I mean that in this sense. If you call us super predators or you call us animals or whatever negative language you use to depict us, and you call us and you say that what you're doing inside these facilities is corrections, that kind of discourse doesn't lend itself to the ideal of correcting someone. If you say that these institutions are designed to rehabilitate us, then identifying us as unworthy of resources that by their very nature make the potential for our lives that much more possible, then you almost cut us off at the knees before the race begins. And so I believe that we all deserve an opportunity to reclaim our humanity, to be redeemed. And I look at the word redemption from the perspective that a price has to be paid in order for a thing to be transacted. And so for me, having the leadership role that I had in prison, translating that into leadership in the community, I feel like I've got to use my life as a sacrifice to show other people what's real for other people that don't have the ability to do what I can do, to share ideas. And has meant for me sacrificing time and energy that could very well be better spent to build up my life personally, but I feel like I would be shirking my responsibility to all the men that I had left behind and other people that represent this reality in our society today. And so redemption for me is about me reclaiming my humanity, sacrificing my time, my energy, and my talents to advocate for a cause that, in my humble opinion, is the issue of our century, mass incarceration. And more of us need to learn how to advocate for ourselves so that people can understand what this system is producing in our lives. To me, that is the redemption process. When we teach other people to reclaim their lives and to be spokespersons for others that can't speak for themselves.